Good morning. Welcome to today's joint subcommittee hearing entitled Examining the Underlying Science and Impact of Glider Truck Regulations. Today we will learn about glider trucks and the lack of sound science underlying the regulations in this industry. For those who may not be familiar, a glider truck is a vehicle comprised of a newly constructed chassis, frame, and cab combined with a remanufactured engine and transmission system from an older vehicle, broadly speaking. In October 2016, Obama's EPA and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration issued a rule requiring glider vehicles to meet the emission standards for the year in which the vehicle is assembled, rather than the year in which the engine was manufactured. Recognizing that this rule, which was slated to take full effect in January 2018, would have devastated the emerging glider kit industry, the Trump administration wisely pursued corrective action. In August of 2017, then EPA Administrator Pruitt stated an intention to repeal the 2016 glider rule, which EPA officially proposed on November 16, 2017. 4 days later, on November 20, 2017, the National Vehicle and Fuel Emissions Laboratory, NVEL, quietly published a study on gliders without notifying EPA leadership. It turns out that Volvo, which had previously supported efforts to increase glider regulations, began secretly working with the NVEL in September of 2017 to conduct this study. The study itself surprised me that it was a very small-end study and that there were only 2 vehicles studied. In July of this year, members of this committee sent a letter to Acting Administrator Andrew Wheeler asking for documents relating to this study. Materials obtained by the committee clearly show that Volvo, a regulated entity, initiated conversations with EPA employees in the NVEL in an apparent effort to shape the outcome of the study by specifying test articles to use and laying out the schedule on which the test program should be conducted. The NVEL only consulted with Volvo and failed to reach out to glider manufacturers for the study. Furthermore, the NVEL based its results on a small and inadequate sample size, only testing 2 glider trucks that were provided, indeed, by Volvo. These facts call into question the integrity of the study. The other disturbing fact about the NVEL study is the timing and manner in which it was performed. Completing this study in November 2017, more than a year after the original rule became final, and just 2 weeks before the public hearing on the proposed repeal of that 2016 rule, is highly suspect. Not informing anybody in EPA leadership about the study before, during, or after it was completed is also concerning. These circumstances demonstrate that there was no scientific foundation for the 2016 rule in the first place and indicates a clear intent to undermine the current administration's policy. Accordingly, it is clear that the 2016 glider rule was politically driven. It makes no sense to require that gliders comply with standards of the year these trucks are assembled. It only serves to hurt small business and help large truck manufacturers. It also discourages the development of innovative technology that helps small businesses compete. Gliders salvage older model engines to create a truck that is affordable, reliable, and safe. Instead of throwing out older vehicle parts and creating more industrial waste, gliders allow old parts to be updated, recycled, and reused. To disregard the benefits of such innovation is an affront to hardworking Americans who rely on these trucks to make a living. Now is not the time to prevent creativity that could help sustain the trucking industry and our economy. Gliders allow for such innovation. Gliders reduce maintenance expenses, have better fuel efficiency, and cost about 25% less than a new truck. These benefits and cost savings allow small companies to allocate funds elsewhere, such as increasing salaries and hiring more drivers. The science that underlies our regulations and policies should be unbiased and should consider all applicable parameters. This means doing the research and hearing from those who understand the industry the best. If 2016 rule is not repealed, then we are setting a precedent for issuing harmful regulations without any proper scientific foundation. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today to learn more about this important issue, and I now recognize the ranking member of the Environment Subcommittee, Ms. Bonamici, for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. The negative effects of air pollution on respiratory health are well documented. Exposure to criteria pollutants such as particulate matter and nitrogen oxides, or NOx, can lead to the exacerbation of respiratory diseases, including asthma, that can have devastating effects, especially on children and the elderly. The Environmental Protection Agency has found that more than half of the NOx emissions inventory in the United States are from the transportation sector, which is why standards limiting criteria pollutant emissions from heavy-duty trucks is key to fulfilling the EPA's mission of protecting public health and the environment. Common sense regulations like the Phase 2 rule for greenhouse gas emission standards for heavy-duty vehicles exemplify what happens when the federal government works collaboratively with regulated industries to create standards that are economically achievable, technically feasible, and protective of public health, something that some members of the majority seem to suggest is impossible. I expect that some of today's witnesses will argue that glider manufacturers have the right to petition the EPA to reopen the Phase 2 rule provisions relating to gliders, which they do. But it should be noted that no glider manufacturer brought challenges in court following the publication of the final Phase 2 rule in 2016. Instead, they waited to lobby an industry-friendly administration to repeal the glider provisions to benefit their bottom line at the cost of public health. Some glider manufacturers claim that using a rebuilt engine in a glider vehicle can save on the greenhouse emissions produced in the steelmaking process. But make no mistake, these one-time emissions savings are insignificant compared with the total lifetime emissions from glider engines without emission controls. The EPA has estimated that restricting the use of high-polluting engines in 10,000 glider vehicles over the lifetime of those vehicles would prevent the emission of up to 400,000 tons of NOx and 6,800 tons of particulate matter and prevent up to 1,600 premature deaths. The fact that so much pollution and so many premature deaths can be traced directly to the manufacture and sale of glider trucks without modern-day emission controls is revealing. Allowing this level of unchecked pollution on our roadways undercuts the progress made in cleaning up diesel engines in the past and is, quite frankly, irresponsible, especially when we have a solution available to us, using engines that meet current emission standards in glider trucks. Also, we are nearly 2 years into this administration, and once again we find ourselves at a hearing that's attacking an existing EPA rule and study without a witness from the EPA to explain and defend it. But I submit that there is no reason to doubt the glider emission studies from the EPA's National Vehicle and Fuel Emissions Laboratory in Ann Arbor, Michigan. The majority only seeks to highlight it because the results are at odds with the glider emission study from Tennessee Tech University that was used to justify the proposed repeal of the glider rule. It's very important to note that the Tennessee Tech study is currently undergoing an internal research misconduct investigation. In fact, the principal investigator of the Tennessee Tech study has not only removed his name from the study, but also returned his portion of the funding he received from Fitzgerald Glider Kits to conduct it. It is unclear why the majority has shown no interest in the study, although it may be because they know that they may not like what they find. Colleagues, this hearing should not distract us from the main issue at hand. Repealing glider truck provisions based on one questionable industry-funded study would have severe consequences for public health. It is also important to note that the effects of repealing these provisions go beyond public health, with many members of the trucking industry standing alongside environmental and public health groups in opposition to the proposed repeal. There are many opportunities for legitimate oversight within the jurisdiction of this committee, yet my colleagues across the aisle seem determined to prop up special interest groups, most often at the expense of public health. Today's hearing on glider truck regulations is another example. Even though Chairman Smith and some of his colleagues have made accusations of collusion between the EPA and Volvo, no representatives from either the EPA or Volvo were invited as witnesses today. I also want to note that when preparing for this hearing, minority staff reached out to the EPA to receive a briefing on the agency's glider emissions study under discussion today. The EPA told the staff that the request would not be granted. We are being throttled from conducting legitimate oversight not only by the majority but also by this administration. I look forward to hearing the testimony from Dr. Paul Miller, who can address legitimate concerns surrounding the proposed repeal of these glider provisions and describe the real-world consequences for states and the public if the production and sale of glider trucks without modern emissions controls are allowed to proliferate unchecked. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I now recognize the Chair of the Oversight Subcommittee, Dr. Abraham, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning and welcome to today's hearing. The Chairman's already defined what a glider kit is, and it does cost 25% in a brand new rig. So really the purpose of today's hearing is twofold. We will examine the economic effects of the Obama administration's greenhouse gas emissions regulation, which among other things, proposed a cap production of glider trucks. We will also address the integrity of a study on glider truck emissions conducted by the EPA's National Vehicle and Fuel Emissions Laboratory, NVFEL in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Documents provided through FOIA and committee requests raise serious questions about the impartiality of the 2017 EPA study. Historically, the Science Committee has worked hard to ensure that when regulations are necessary, they are based on sound science. Under Chairman Smith, the committee has also worked to level the playing field and ensure that the EPA treats all parties fairly. In the case of glider trucks, there are red flags surrounding the NVFEL study. The committee obtained emails showing that one particular manufacturer had an inside track to EPA and, in fact, provided the glider trucks they did not manufacture to EPA for testing. And I'll get into the details of the EPA studies with my questions further in the hearing. But from the outset, the conflict of interest raises questions about the study's credibility. Relying on a flawed study in this case is particularly alarming since the proposed regulation will have dire consequences for the glider truck industry. Thousands of independent truckers, all smart businesses across America, rely on glider trucks as an affordable option for their trucking operation. In my district alone, there are 883 independent truckers, many of whom drive gliders. For me, this is a jobs issue. We should not allow the heavy hand of the federal government to come down and crush an entire industry, especially absent a rock-solid scientific reason for doing so, which appears to be lacking in this case. In addition to the individual truckers and manufacturers of the glider kits would be put out of business, killing even more jobs. At the request of my colleagues, the EPA Inspector General has agreed to review the propriety of the study, and we look forward to the results of his review. We have joining us a witness today, experts that are experts on regulatory law. I look forward to hearing from that testimony. And I want to briefly address the regulatory steps EPA has taken in this instance and assure everyone that contrary to the picture painted by the media in the headlines such as, quote, Scott Pruitt gave dirty glider trucks a gift in his last days at EPA, unquote, or, quote, super polluting trucks received loophole on Pruitt's last day, unquote, EPA does not appear to have done anything out of the ordinary in this case. Accordingly, or according to the administration law experts, agencies routinely take the similar steps EPA took with regard to glider trucks. Agencies have broad discretion about which regulations to enforce. What actually was out of the ordinary was that the Obama administration's failure to conduct a study on glider truck emissions prior to proposing the Phase 2 greenhouse gas rule. More work needs to be done to understand the impact of gliders on the environment. Many experts argue that using remanufactured parts over the lifetime of the trucks actually has a positive environmental impact. I look forward to hearing our witnesses' opinions on the environmental issue. More work is needed in this area. We cannot simply rely on EPA studies in this instance, and I yield my remaining time to Mr. Posey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 2016, a Chinese-owned Volvo Trucks and its affiliates.
Microphone, please.
In 2016, a Chinese-owned Volvo Trucks and its affiliates lobbied the EPA to secure a cap and prohibition on glider trucks in the Phase 2 rule. The previous administration's EPA never tested or studied gliders before finalizing the rule. This would eliminate the business operations of several American-owned glider assemblies. In 2017, the administration sought to roll back this burdensome cap and prohibition regulation. After EPA put forth a notice of intent to revisit Phase 2 rule regulated by glider trucks, Volvo contacted career employees at EPA's National Vehicle Fuel Emissions Laboratory to propose the idea of studying gliders. Incredibly, foreign-owned Volvo told the National Vehicle Fuel Emissions Laboratory how and when they would like the testing performed against the American industry. It paid for and procured the gliders to be tested. They told the laboratory what was ideal from a testing perspective and wanted to create an emissions test that would show gliders to be super polluting. For example, one of the trucks supplied by Volvo had its engine check light illuminated, and the other had an entire chamber full of oil in the harness. Furthermore, the agency used a biodiesel fuel instead of the mandated ultra-low sulfur diesel fuel, according to the EPA. Ultra-low sulfur sulfur diesel eliminates up to 95% of all emissions. This test was performed unbeknownst to the administrator's knowledge. Gliders serve America's small businesses, transportation fleets, family farms and ranches, and independent owner operations. Foreign-owned Volvo has put out a narrative that gliders are a
Gentleman's
threat to the
time is
environment.
expired.
However, the hypocritical Volvo operates an entire plant in Sweden that remanufactures diesel truck engines. They even tout the environmental benefits of these engines. Volvo cannot have it both ways. They're either a threat to the environment or a net benefit.
Time has expired.
Thank you, Mr.
Sorry. Thank you. Chair recognizes the distinguished chairman of the Oversight Subcommittee, excuse me, ranking member, let's get that right, of the Oversight Subcommittee, Mr. Byer, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. And thank you, Chairman Abraham. Thank you, Chairman Biggs. The majority may portray this issue as one of big business versus small business. Since independent glider manufacturers constitute the main opposition to these glider regulations, I am a small business person myself, so I'm sympathetic to the challenges that small businesses face. But for the sake of transparency, Volvo Cars, I have been a Volvo dealer since 1974. We own 3 Volvo dealerships. It's a completely distinct entity from Volvo Group, which sells the trucks and the construction equipment. They split off in 1999. So I'm not involved at all. By the way, Volvo Cars is owned by the Chinese. It was owned by Ford Motor Company for a number of years, which is why so many Fords look like Volvo chassis. But they sold Volvo Cars to the Chinese. Volvo Trucks, not a Chinese company. It is a Swedish company. It is foreign-owned, but it's not Chinese. By the way, they are made in Dublin, Virginia. It's one of the major manufacturers in my state. Very few of them are imported. They're mostly made here in the United States. Our clean air, the public health should not be jeopardized in order to protect any business, though large or small. Glider trucks are new trucks powered by remanufactured, heavily polluting engines that are not up to today's standards. And former EPA Administrator Pruitt's attempts to repeal the glider regulations would endanger the public health in significant and well-documented ways. And that's why the American Lung Association, the American Medical Association, many other health associations all oppose the Pruitt EPA attempts to repeal the glider regulations. And though companies like Fitzgerald Glider Kits may describe themselves as a small business, they really have an outsized influence on this debate. They held a rally for candidate Donald Trump. They met with former EPA Administrator Pruitt. They've generated multiple congressional letters. The majority has chosen to focus solely on discrediting one glider emissions study performed at EPA's National Vehicle and Fuel Emissions Laboratory. But as my colleague, Ms. Monamichi, said, the majority didn't invite an EPA witness today, and the EPA even refused to brief the minority staff when it was asked. So EPA's refusal leaves us in the dark about the very issues at the center of this proposed repeal, including a questionable Texas Tech University study that was funded by Fitzgerald Glider Kits, which Pruitt EPA relied on in its efforts to repeal the glider regulation. So you have essentially the fox guarding the henhouse. In January 2018, the study's principal investigator was so concerned about his integrity that he removed his name. He returned the $70,000 that Fitzgerald paid. In February 2018, the president of Tennessee Tech wrote to the EPA informing that the study was undergoing an internal scientific misconduct review and requesting that the EPA not use or even reference the study until conclusion of that investigation. In May of 2018, the EPA's Science Advisory Board authorized a review of the Pruitt glider rule, reporting that the supporting science lacks transparency regarding the source of and basis for data, and failed to take into account its own study that demonstrated significantly higher vehicle emissions from gliders than from trucks. And the Office of Management and Budget has reportedly told the EPA that Pruitt's proposed glider repeal rule is incomplete because it lacks a regulatory impact analysis. But today, the majority is likely to focus on the rulemaking procedures as opposed to public health. But fortunately, we have Dr. Miller, Deputy Director and Chief Scientist of the Northeast States for Coordinated Air Use Management, is here today to help us understand the environmental and health consequences of unregulated glider production. We hold this hearing as Hurricane Florence is bearing down on the Carolinas. In the past year, we've seen extreme weather events from huge forest fires in California that we recognized on the House floor yesterday, a massive hurricane in Puerto Rico, devastate communities nationwide. And evidence shows overwhelming that climate change has intensified these extreme weather events, leading to ever more destruction. And I really hope that one day this committee can explore the scientific evidence behind such events rather than ignoring the facts. I'm one of, I believe, 6 automobile dealers in the U.S. House. I think I'm the only certified automobile mechanic in the U.S. Congress. And as I've come to understand the glider rule, I wondered, what if I took a new Volvo body or Subaru body or Mazda body and put an old pre-engine control engine into it. It would be a lot cheaper. It'd be a lot more affordable for a lot of people, but the impact, what if every new car dealer and manufacturer just simply retrofit old pre-emissions control engines into the new bodies they had today? That's exactly what we're dealing with the glider issue. It's a way of completely undercutting all the progress we've made in clean air from automobile emissions, and I hope that we will resist it. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Byer. I want to recognize we have a new member of this committee, and so I welcome Representative Troy Balderson. He's not sure whether to say thank you or not. He's kind of, yeah, I don't blame you. We're glad to have you as a member of the Science Committee. Representative Balderson represents Ohio's 12th district and was sworn into the House last week. He's a former farmer and businessman. Representative Balderson also served as a member of the Ohio State Senate and the State House of Representatives before joining us here in the House of Representatives. And I hope all of you will join me in welcoming Troy. We look forward to working with you.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Before I introduce our witnesses, I note that Mr. Todd Spencer, the president of Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association, was scheduled to be on our panel today, but had to withdraw at the last minute to attend to a family matter in Missouri. Thankfully, Mr. Collin Long from the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association was able to be here in his place. Thank you, Mr. Long, for your quick accommodation. We wish the best to Mr. Spencer. Now I'm going to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness today is Ms. Linda Tsang. She is a legislative attorney for the Congressional Research Service and has been in that role since 2016. Ms. Tsang previously worked at the EPA as a rule manager environmental engineer from 2000 to 2004. She became the Director of Climate and Air Quality at the American Forest and Paper Association and was in that position from 2013 to 2016. She holds a bachelor's degree from Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Environmental Engineering and a Juris Doctorate from the Vermont Law School. Thank you for joining us today. Our second witness is Mr. Collin Long, Director of Government Affairs at the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association. Mr. Long previously worked for Congressman Charles Dent in a variety of roles from 2005 to 2012 and went to work for the Portland Cement Association from 2012 to 2016. His bachelor's degree is from Syracuse University. Our next witness is Dr. Paul J. Miller, Deputy Director and Chief Scientist at the Northeast States for Coordinated Air Use Management. He previously worked at NESCOM from 1995 to 1999 as a Senior Science and Policy Advisor. Dr. Miller then went to the Commission on Environment Cooperation as an Air Quality Program Coordinator from 1999 to 2005. Dr. Miller holds a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Purdue University, a doctorate in chemical physics from Yale, and a JD from Stanford University. Glad to have you with us, Dr. Miller. Our final witness is Dr. Richard Belzer, an independent consultant in the regulation, risk, economics, and information quality sector. Dr. Belzer worked as a staff economist at the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs within the U.S. Office of Management and Budget from 1988 to 1998. He was also a visiting professor of public policy at Washington University in St. Louis before consulting. He received a master's degree in agricultural economics from UC Davis in 1980. Dr. Belzer also received a master's in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School in 1982 and his doctorate in public policy from Harvard University in 1989. I now recognize Ms. Tsang for 5 minutes to present her testimony.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Biggs, Chairman Abraham, Ranking Member Bonamici, Ranking Member Byer, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Linda Tsang. I'm a legislative attorney in the American Law Division of the Congressional Research Service. Thank you for inviting me this morning to testify on behalf of CRS. I will be addressing the rulemaking process EPA used to adopt the emission standards for glider vehicles, engines, and kits, and the process EPA is using to repeal them. While there may be a number of legal, policy, and science questions related to these rulemakings, my testimony this morning focuses on the legal requirements related to the rulemaking process. While the Administrative Procedure Act generally governs agency rulemaking, Congress established procedures in Section 307D of the Clean Air Act that apply to the regulation of new motor vehicle emissions. These procedures require EPA, among other things, to provide public notice and comment on the proposed rule. EPA must also describe the basis and purpose of the rule, factual data, legal interpretations, policy considerations, and other supporting information. The final rule must also respond to significant comments and identify any changes to the rule since the proposal. Operating under these specific rulemaking requirements, in 2016, EPA and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, known commonly as NHTSA, jointly published the second phase of greenhouse gas emissions and fuel efficiency standards for medium and heavy-duty trucks and engines. In addition to setting greenhouse gas emission standards in the Phase 2 rule, EPA finalized requirements for glider kits, engines, and vehicles. EPA defines a glider kit as a chassis for a tractor-trailer with a frame, front axle, interior and exterior cab, and brakes. It becomes a glider vehicle when an engine, transmission, and rear axle are added. Beyond the Clean Air Act rulemaking requirements, EPA must comply with various statutes and executive orders on rulemaking. For example, to comply with Executive Order 12866, which addresses the administration's review of agency regulations, EPA and NHTSA developed a regulatory impact analysis and submitted the proposed and final versions of the rule to the White House's Office of Management and Budget for review. EPA also submitted its proposed repeal of the glider provisions to OMB and has not yet submitted the final rule for review. In addition, EPA and NHTSA reviewed impacts of the Phase 2 rule to small businesses to comply with the Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Fairness Act. In the final Phase 2 rule, the agencies implemented some of the Small Business Advocacy Review Panel's recommendations to reduce the regulatory burdens on small businesses, including glider vehicle assemblers. For the proposed repeal of the glider provisions, the EPA administrator certified the repeal would not have a significant economic impact on small entities because it is a deregulatory action. EPA must also provide a notice of its proposed rules to its Science Advisory Board. Congress directed EPA to establish the SAB to provide scientific advice to the agency and to certain congressional committees, including this one. For the Phase 2 rule, the SAB concluded that the underlying science for the rule did not merit further review. For the proposed repeal of the glider provisions, the SAB decided this past July to review the science supporting the proposed repeal, including a review of the emission rates related to glider vehicles. To conclude, the Clean Air Act provides detailed procedures that apply to both the Phase 2 rule and EPA's proposed repeal of the glider provisions in that rule. In addition, EPA must also comply with the various statutes and executive orders related to rulemaking. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I'll be happy to answer any questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you so much. Now I recognize Mr. Long for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Chairman Biggs and Abraham, Ranking Member Bonamici and Beyer, and members of the committee, thank you for providing me the opportunity to testify today. As you heard, my name is Collin Long. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association, which you may have heard is called OIDA. OIDA represents more than 160,000 small business truckers across the U.S. That comprises about 96% of the trucking industry. OIDA members have experienced firsthand how federal policy changes can dramatically reshape our industry. Unfortunately, these policies always place the heaviest burden on the men and women who own small businesses and rarely benefit their operations in terms of safety or economics. Too often, Washington pursues regulations with little regard for the practical implications or understanding of how they will affect our members. The current discussion surrounding glider kits perfectly encapsulates this problem. Since 2002, federal emission reduction standards have increased the cost of new trucks between $50,000 and $70,000. As a result, purchasing a new vehicle has become prohibitively expensive for small business owners. One of the ways our members can manage their costs while operating at a high level of efficiency is through the purchase of glider kits, which, as you've heard, are about 25% less expensive. A driver's livelihood depends upon a reliable vehicle that rarely breaks down and can handle the demands of long-haul trucking. Unfortunately, our members who have purchased new trucks with the latest emission reduction technology have found them to be incredibly unreliable. If a truck becomes a liability by routinely being inoperable, the owner must absorb the cost of lost productivity while also paying for the necessary repairs. Because of emissions requirements, today's new trucks also utilize complicated and expensive technology, which requires the expertise of specialized technicians with proprietary machinery who are only found at authorized dealerships. Before repairs even begin, owner-operators typically have to pay hundreds of dollars just to have the problem diagnosed. For some, the task of even finding an authorized dealer can be challenging and expensive. Drivers typically purchase glider kits with remanufactured engines because it allows them to diagnose and repair mechanical issues without the need for a technician or specialized equipment. A glider kit's reliability extends beyond routine maintenance, though, as fuel efficiency is either closely matched or in some cases exceeds a new truck's. This is because gliders are specifically designed to achieve the best miles per gallon performance possible. The average long-haul trucker will drive anywhere between 100 and 120,000 miles a year, meaning any improvement to a vehicle's performance can have a significant impact on overall fuel consumption. On average, each of our members purchase over 19,000 gallons of fuel per year. An increase in fuel efficiency by just 1 mile per gallon would save almost 3,000 gallons of diesel per truck. While others will debate the environmental impacts associated with emission reductions, we think it's important to consider how the use of glider kits affects our industry's consumption of fossil fuels. A substantial increase in glider kit appeal has developed among OOIDA members in recent years. In a 2018 survey of owner-operators, 14% of respondents who plan to purchase a commercial motor vehicle in the next several years favored glider kits, while only 12% indicated they would buy an entirely new truck. These figures illustrate a dramatic growth in the glider kit market, as in 2003, just 3% of our members indicated a preference for gliders. Chairman Biggs and Chairman Abraham, thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. I hope I've been able to give you a new perspective on why glider kits are so important to small business truckers. In my written testimony, I've included the story of an OOIDA member who made the decision to purchase glider kits as a means to save his business. These stories are common among our members, but are too often lost in this debate or disregarded as anecdotal. OOIDA appreciates the opportunity to explain why our members support the EPA's proposal to reconsider the emission requirement for glider kits. Exempting these vehicles from Phase 2 regulations will continue to provide small business truckers with affordable, reliable, and efficient options when purchasing new or used trucks. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I now recognize Dr. Miller for 5 minutes for his testimony.
Good morning. I thank the chairs and the ranking members and all the members of these subcommittees for providing NESCOM with the opportunity today to offer the following comments on the science and impacts of glider kits on air quality. NESCOM, by way of introduction, the Northeast States for Coordinated Air Use Management, is a nonprofit regional association of state air pollution control agencies in Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, and Vermont. And we provide at NESCOM policy and technical support to our state members in furtherance of their air quality and climate programs. Our member state agencies have the primary responsibility for developing strategies that will attain and maintain air quality that is protective of public health and the environment for their citizens and those living downwind in out-of-state areas. NESCOM and our member states strongly oppose a repeal of emission requirements for glider kit trucks because of the very serious harm to air quality and public health that will occur if this loophole is reopened. At its core, absolving new glider vehicles from complying with current engine standards is inconsistent with the Clean Air Act's primary purpose to protect and enhance the quality of the nation's air resources so as to promote public health and welfare. With over 42 million people in the Northeast, the New York City metro region, and beyond, we still continue to have episodes of poor air quality, both for ground level ozone, of which nitrogen oxides or NOx are a primary contributor, and particulate matter. And during severe events, the extent of this can extend over 200,000 square miles across the eastern United States. Local and regional sources contribute to this problem. Diesel exhaust is a major source of particulate matter and nitrogen oxides contributing to this, and it is responsible for tens of thousands of premature deaths, hospital admissions, and lost work and school days in the U.S. annually. Diesel particulate matter in exhaust has been linked to increased cancer and non-cancer health risks. Based on the science, EPA considers diesel exhaust a likely human carcinogen when inhaled. The California Air Resources Board listed it as a known carcinogen, as does the International Agency for Research on Cancer, an arm of the World Health Organization. Peer-reviewed studies continue to strengthen the case that exposure to particulate matter at levels below current health standards are damaging of public health. In its 2016 Phase 2 rulemaking, EPA correctly recognized that while glider kits can have legitimate uses as sources of powertrain engines, salvaged from wrecked vehicles, they have increasingly been marketed as so-called pre-emission engines. In other words, engines that don't meet current standards. We agree with EPA's original analysis and its more recent 2017 glider kit emissions testing showing the distinction between glider kits using 2002 and earlier engines versus engines meeting current emission standards. EPA estimates are requiring glider vehicles to meet the same NOx and PM emission limits with current engine standards reduce 190,000 tons per year of NOx and 5,000 tons per year of PM emissions in 2025. That would grow to 319,000 tons per year of NOx and 8,500 tons per year of particulate matter in 2040. The reason this is important to our states is because NOx emissions, we continue to violate the ozone standard. NOx emissions are the primary precursor pollutant to ozone. Ozone's not directly emitted. And on-road highway diesel vehicles are about 25% of our NOx emissions inventory, causing our ozone problem. We cannot address our ozone problem without addressing glider kits. 5,000 glider kits are the equivalent NOx emissions of about 200,000 new vehicles meeting current engine standards. So a relatively small portion of those engines, those kits, contribute disproportionately to our problems. With regards to the testing, we believe that EPA's approach is consistent with their own state approaches. They use an accredited testing lab. They followed a standard regulatory drive cycle. They provided data sets with transparent analysis. They maintained rigorous quality assurance and quality control. And they did the test in triplicate. Comparing this, and working, by the way, with industry on these testing programs as standard procedure with our states is something I think that should be encouraged, and we certainly don't see a problem with that. So this is not at odds with what Assistant Administrator William Wareham described in the letter to this committee. Contrast to Tennessee Tech, uncredited facility owned by a glider manufacturer, did not use a regulatory test cycle, did not repeat test runs, did not report the actual data. So it's a subjective analysis, it's a visual inspection of a probe that's used by mechanics, not by our states in using to comparative certification, and no NOx emissions data were presented. So we have no idea, actually, of what the true results were. So with that, I conclude my statement, and I am happy to take questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Miller. I now recognize Dr. Belzer for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Hey, good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to testify concerning work I conducted in May for Fitzgerald glider kits. This is a strawman regulatory impact analysis for EPA's regulation rescinding the glider provisions in what is being called the Phase 2 greenhouse gas rule. That work is my own work product. I performed it from start to finish in about 2 weeks. Fitzgerald did not have the right to approve it, and it is published as a working paper on my website. Now, I had to perform this because normally one would look to the regulatory impact analysis for the Phase 2 rule to find the benefits and costs of rescinding a provision. One cannot do that, however, because the Phase 2 rule regulatory impact analysis is significantly incomplete. So I have 4 key points to make. You'll see it on the next slide there. There are significant errors in EPA's analysis. They came up with $238 billion in present value net social benefits. They committed several errors. Two I will mention. First, they assumed that companies that buy trucks are unable to rationally account for fuel economy in their purchase decisions. Now, this is an astounding claim. Fuel is the largest cost of operating a heavy-duty truck. Second, EPA estimated that the Phase 2 rule would send $66 billion in U.S. wealth to other countries, and they counted these wealth transfers as benefits to Americans. This is an elementary violation of accepted practice in benefit cost analysis. When you take these two errors out alone, you end up with $26 billion in net present value costs for the Phase 2 rule. This is shown on that slide in front of you. EPA also did not analyze the incremental benefits and costs of banning gliders. Go to the next slide, please. The regulatory impact analysis is 1,100 pages long. That's more than 2 reams of paper. In that, there is no analysis of the benefits and costs of essentially banning gliders from the heavy-duty truck market. So what do? Well, you go to the preamble to the 2016 rule, and there you will see that EPA reports an estimate for the benefits of it. The preamble is almost 800 pages long. This part, surrounded by yellow highlighter, is the total sum of their analysis of the benefits of the glider, of regulating gliders. So they didn't show their work, and since they didn't show their work, nobody outside of EPA can actually replicate it. To obtain their estimate, though, they also seem to have assumed that every glider removed from the market is a new truck sold. That makes no sense. Those who would have purchased gliders couldn't buy a new truck. They could buy a used truck from the secondary market, or they could retain an existing truck in service longer than its planned lifetime. Let's assume that new trucks have fewer emissions, lower emissions than gliders. But it's likely that used trucks and old trucks retained in service have higher emissions. So the question is, what's the net change in emissions? And the net change in emissions from from banning gliders could well be positive, not the $6 to $14 billion in benefits that the EPA claimed. Now, my analysis shows how to estimate the environmental benefits and costs. Go to the next slide, please. And I don't have any data to estimate these net benefits or costs because EPA didn't collect the data prior to regulating gliders. But I can tell you what the condition would be, and that's how you would go about it. What you are looking for are emissions for all 4 types of vehicles, and you weight them by their environmental impacts, and from that you try to estimate what proportion of gliders would be replaced by new trucks. Policymakers can look at that and decide, is that reasonable or is that not? It requires good data, objective data. Obtaining good emissions data is challenging because it's really easy to get bad data. You can tweak the emissions tests, or even more easily by selecting trucks likely to test the way you want them to. But it's important to have a sample that's large enough to extrapolate to the market. And I don't know how large that sample would have to be, but I do know that 2 is not the optimal sample size. I do know that it could be done better, and I think the right way to go about this is actually to collaborate on a test protocol, do the tests together, so that everybody is in agreement that the tests are performed correctly and honestly. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I thank all the witnesses for their testimony today and again for being with us. And now it's time for questions, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. And I just want to clarify some points made by the minority that I disagree with about the Tennessee Tech study. This hearing is not relying on the Tennessee Tech study, quite frankly, and you'll notice that none of us mentioned that except for on the other side. We're not here to discuss that study or offer it as proof of gliders being environmentally friendly. We're here to examine the EPA Infel study, for which we have documents showing undue influence from Volvo. Furthermore, when then Administrator Pruitt relied upon Tennessee Tech study, it was the only glider study in existence because EPA had not completed its study yet, let alone inform the EPA leadership that a study was in progress. The mere fact that there are 2 studies now at odds with one another, in addition to questionable practices that indicate bias, illustrates the need for a more in-depth examination of this issue, and that's what I think we're trying to get at today, the need for more in-depth analysis. I want to go to Mr. Long first. Can you please elaborate on some of the issues facing the trucking industry today as far as workforce shortage and business expenses, as far as those are concerned?
Sure, I'd love to. We contend there is no shortage of drivers, which you've all been hearing there is. There's a turnover problem. That's because a lot of folks are unable to remain in the business. This is a typical reason why. Right now, as I mentioned, our testimony includes a story of a gentleman who owns a small business that's been in his family since the 1960s. And he was faced with the problem of whether or not to purchase new glider kits to remain in business or to exit the trucking industry altogether. And that was because he had purchased some new trucks with all the environmental technology included. And they were so unreliable that they were costing him tens of thousands of dollars a year. And not only in repairs, in lost productivity because they spent so much time in the shop getting worked on. So he came up with the decision to purchase gliders as an alternative because they were much more reliable and he was capable of maintaining them better on his own. So I would say regulation as a whole is driving a lot of our members out of the industry. In this case, it's costs driving them out of the industry. Certainly every regulation comes with a cost, but in this one, it's taking away a reliable alternative option for them to purchase a new truck.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Belzer, I want to get to your brief but very informative testimony. You've suggested that there be more collaboration on a study. I was surprised that it was what I would call an extreme small-end study. What could have been done differently to produce a more transparency and eliminate what I view as bias? I mean, every time you have a study, if you're conducting the scientific method the way I was taught, you want to eliminate bias as much as possible. How would we do that here?
Well, I should first say I'm not an engineer, so I would hesitate to attempt to devise the protocol. But what needs to be done is a protocol needs to be agreed upon by EPA and the various different stakeholders in the industry. There should be a way of agreeing on how to do this properly. And that would include all the different elements of the test, and it doesn't sound like there's a great deal of controversy about what those would be. It would also include a sample size and a procedure for selecting trucks for the sampling. Remember, what you're doing is you're extrapolating to an entire industry from a very small sample. The opportunity for error, never mind bias, but opportunity for error is just very great, and a sample of 2 doesn't do it. No matter how well the 2 were collected or assembled, a sample of a dozen may not be enough. I'm not an expert in sampling theory and how to go about that. But I think that if they collaborate on the technology for the test, they collaborate on doing the test, they look over each other's shoulders, that's the way to get it done and make sure everybody's happy with it. Then you can go forward with it and use it for policy purposes.
Thank you. I'm going to conclude my time and recognize the ranking member of the Environment Subcommittee, Ms. Bonamici, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Some of today's witnesses have argued that the EPA's deregulatory action on gliders should not require a regulatory impact analysis. And several members of the majority actually made a similar argument in a recent letter to the OMB. But I'd like to bring to their attention a 2017 White House memorandum that states, quote, agencies must continue to assess and consider both the benefits and costs of regulatory actions, including deregulatory actions. So I'd like to request unanimous consent to enter this memo into the record.
Without objection?
We also must recognize the consequences of deregulation. In fact, in August, the regulatory impact analysis for the Trump administration's rollback of the Clean Power Plan, which is also known as the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, was released to the public with a shocking conclusion. In fact, a New York Times headline says it all, cost of new EPA coal rules up to 1,400 more deaths a year. These estimates were from the EPA's own technical analysis. I request unanimous consent to enter this article into the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The pollutants, including carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and particulate matter, are similar to those that would increase should glider regulations be rolled back. Mr. Long, my uncle was a long-haul truck driver, and like a Representative Beyer said, he's a small business owner. We hear those concerns. We want to make sure that this committee can work on addressing those concerns without jeopardizing public health and the environment. Also, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Posey suggested that the EPA lab testing was somehow compromised because a check engine light was on one of the glider vehicles when it arrived at the facility. However, the EPA report fully acknowledges this and details that it was a result of oil in a connector of oil temperature sensor, and that was cleaned, reinstalled, and repaired prior to the testing. The issue did not appear for the remainder of the testing, so implications that the study was compromised because of this are therefore demonstrably false, and I'd like to enter that EPA report into the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Miller, thank you for your testimony. What is your assessment of the claim that regulatory impact analysis are not necessary for deregulatory actions? And based on your expertise, what might a regulatory impact analysis demonstrate for the proposed rollback of glider regulations?
I think as you noted, OMB guidance, I think OMB Circular A4, in addition, requires that regulatory and deregulatory actions all go through a regulatory impact assessment. And I think in this case, based on the number of excess emissions from glider vehicles with pre-control engines, especially the most popular pre-2002 engines, you're talking about potential implications of up to 1,600 avoided premature deaths, and the costs of that is about $11 billion. When associated with the excess emissions of about 5,000 glider trucks, if you do the math, that's a foregone health benefit of about $1.1 million per truck. And that's what a regulatory impact assessment of rolling back this loophole repeal would show. I would also like to state very quickly, in this context of only 2 trucks, California also did roadside monitoring, entered into the rulemaking docket. That's very consistent with the EPA dynamometer tests in the lab. And so there is backing for that as well. And I'd also like to emphasize the physical implausibility of an engine with no emission controls being as clean as an engine with modern emission controls. It defies physical explanation. The comment that sulfate emissions are reduced by 98% is technically true, but irrelevant. Sulfate emissions, primary sulfate emissions out of a diesel engine are only a few percent of total particulate emissions. Most of it is carbon-based with toxic metals, organics. Sulfate is only a small part. The reason
Dr.
for
Miller,
lowering...
I want to get one more question. I don't want to interrupt, but I want to get one more question
Sorry.
in the remaining time. I noticed in your impressive bio that you have not only a science background, but a law degree. So I wanted to ask you, the proposed EPA rule published in November of 2017 justified a repeal on restrictions on glider vehicle production by claiming that glider vehicles and engines do not constitute new motor vehicles or engines according to the Clean Air Act. What's your response to that?
I think it defies the purpose of the Clean Air Act. It's going through a legal contortion interpretation to undermine the general purpose Congress set out in the beginning of the Clean Air Act, that it is to protect the nation's air resources and protect public health and environment. You really have to go through contortions looking at, for example, a 1958 Consumer Protection Information Law to try to get around if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. These are new engines. These are new vehicles with old engines, installed. And they are meant to circumvent the post-2010 emission standards. They're advertised as pre-emissions. And it's a huge portion of our emissions inventory. If these emissions are out there, our own local businesses are going to incur costs at 2, maybe 3, maybe 4, maybe greater times to compensate for those emissions that we're going to have to reduce. So those are additional costs we have to deal with.
Thank you. I see my time has expired. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I'm a physician by trade, and I was taught very early in medical school to, when you review a scientific article, to look at the author, whether there's bias or not, and look at the sample size. And I think in this particular EPA study, there's certainly a credibility issue as far as size and possible bias. Dr. Belzer, I'll ask you, in my testimony, I've got 800 independent and small business truckers who, you know, their business, their livelihood depends on these trucks. What's the estimated price difference between a glider and a new truck? That's for you, Dr. Belzer.
It's my understanding that it is 25 to 30, it was a quarter to a third less expensive for a glider than a new truck, and therefore a new truck would be about 40% more expensive
So,
than a
and if
glider.
these EPA imposes these regulations that eliminate the cost competitive option like these glider kits, is it safe to assume that the price for new trucks would go up?
I don't know. I think that it might. I think that it depends on the proportion of sales involved. I suspect that the number of glider buyers who would go to buy new trucks is very small, and that they would tend toward buying used trucks or rehabilitating their existing ones. I don't think that the numbers of gliders is very large compared to the total number of heavy-duty Class 8 trucks being sold. So it's possible that the price could go up, but it's hard to tell how much that would be. I think the likely effect is elsewhere.
And the likelihood of a glider owner having to go buy a new truck or actually buying a new truck is probably not significant.
Well, that is the key question. I believe that what EPA did in its paragraph of analysis is it assumed that that's exactly what they would do, and they would do nothing else. Now, to be clear, I can't tell what they did because they don't disclose their model, but it is consistent with the estimated emissions or the reported emissions that are being bandied about. That they've taken the 5,000 or 10,000 gliders and replaced them with brand new trucks. That would not happen in the market.
Mr. Long, in your testimony, you mentioned the growing popularity of glider trucks and how they play a great role in keeping that market stable and competitive. How does that EPA's Phase 2 regulations on the glider industry impact the availability and affordability of truck equipment?
I'm not sure we've really seen an impact yet, but it's certainly going to affect how our drivers view decisions down the road on what to purchase, which they, quite frankly, have to face continuously. I mean, a truck can go south pretty quickly, and they'll be forced to purchase a new vehicle. The problem is most of our members can no longer afford new vehicles because of all the equipment that are associated with emissions reductions technology that have been placed on them by the government. So also touching on what Ranking Member Bonamici had to say is that a lot of these members are forced to drive their current trucks into the ground before they even consider replacing them. These aren't necessarily any cleaner than a glider kit, which they can at least specify with better aerodynamics, better fuel efficiency. So it really isn't, the choice for our members is whether or not they continue with their current truck and try and get every mile out of it, whether they buy a a used truck, or whether they purchase a glider kit because they simply can't afford new trucks at this point.
All right, thank you. Ms. Tsang, in the case of glider trucks, the EPA under the Obama administration did conduct a regulatory impact analysis before proposing the Phase 2 greenhouse gas rules. However, this RIA lacked any thorough analysis on the glider provisions. Is it unusual that the EPA did not engage in a full analysis?
Thank you, Chairman. I can generally speak to the regulatory impact analysis process that EPA used. There was some justification in terms of why they were looking at certain modeling data for the glider kits, but beyond that, I can look further into that after the hearing.
Okay, is there any regulatory impact analysis on all aspects of a regulation required, or agencies required to follow the analysis?
In terms of, there are OMB procedures in terms of how to conduct the regulatory impact analysis.
Okay, let's continue that then. In the normal course, is it fair to say that agencies issuing rules that affect an entire industry would do such an analysis prior to proposing the rule?
Under Executive Order 12866, significant economic regulations require to go through a cost-benefit analysis if it significantly affects the economy, over $100 million, and there are other criteria as well. So if the agency considers a regulation a significant regulation, it must go through this cost-benefit analysis.
Okay, thank you. I'm out of time. Mr. Chris, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. It seems to me that if the EPA moves forward with a repeal of glider regulations, that will effectively turn over the decision to how to treat gliders to the states. As I'm sure you know, California has already approved glider regulations that align with the 2016 standards. There also seems to be a lot more awareness now than there was a few years ago of the health impact of gliders. Given this, and as a former governor, I could see several states following in California's footsteps. Dr. Miller, I'd be curious, can you please comment on whether you think my interpretation of the situation is accurate? Could states start regulating glider vehicles on their own if there is no federal standard in place?
Thank you. I will speculate. If, which I think is unlikely, but if it is determined EPA does not have statutory authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate glider kits, then states would not be preempted from regulating glider kits on their own. Based on the air pollution problem we have in the Northeast, and presumably other states have similar problems elsewhere, I can say our states will look very, very closely at least banning glider kits with pre-2010 engines, and I would hope the glider kit manufacturers tell potential buyers that their trucks may not be allowed in those states. So yeah, I think it's going to have an implication because we have to deal with these trucks. We have to deal with new trucks too, meeting new standards. We don't think they're going to be clean enough for us. So it's not just glider kits. It's everything heavy duty on the road, and we've got to deal with it or we're not going to achieve our standards and public health protection.
What do you think would be a tipping point for states to decide to write their own regulations?
Allowing the unlimited production of pre-2010 glider kit engines or glider kit vehicles with those engines, yeah.
What challenges might arise if different states have differing policies on glider vehicles?
As I mentioned earlier, you're going to have a problem with interstate trucking trying to go from one place to another where they may not be allowed to go through a particular state and have to go around it.
Dr. Miller, in your testimony, you mentioned that the older engines typically used higher glider vehicles lack certain safety features such as electronic stability control and lane departure warnings. Can you elaborate on what these safety features are and how a driver and the public may be affected by the lack of these safety features?
Yes, so the most popular glider kit engines, the pre-2010 engines, do not have the electronic capacity to run a number of modern electric safety features. That includes things like electronic stability control to prevent rollover, the adaptive cruise control to limit excess speed, and lane departure warnings to prevent collisions. So those are features that modern engines, current engines, have the capacity to support, but the older pre-2002 engines do not.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chris. Mr. Posey, you recognize.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This hearing was called because of a possible complicity between Volvo and career employees at the National Vehicle Fuel Emissions Laboratory to create a faulty, if not fraudulent, emission study of gliders to eliminate competition from some small American manufacturers. Despite the other side's attempt to make this an issue about whether gliders are good or gliders are bad, or whether they're hurting the environment or whether they're helping the environment, this hearing is about an agency's violation of the public trust, and that's what we're here to try and rein in. And so, Dr. Miller, the Northeast States for Coordinated Air Use Management advocacy group, is it affiliated with other advocacy groups, lobbying associations, trade associations, or think tanks?
Affiliated in a legal sense? No.
Okay. in a non-legal sense?
We work with other groups that are common interest with the states and their interest to protect public health. Yes, we do.
Have they ever been asked by advocacy groups, lobbying associations, trade associations, think tanks, or whatever, to offer positions in an attempt to influence lawmakers or regulators?
We have been asked from time to time for those things. We check with our states. If they're consistent with their own state interests, we take all comers. I would assume if a constituent asked you something, you would look at it the same way.
Okay. Does it ever act in response to a request to influence lawmakers or regulators on behalf of those requesting assistance?
On behalf, you mean the entity asking NESCOM ask on their behalf?
Yeah.
We do not ask on others' behalf. It has to make sense for our states. We get asked, but we have to run it through our own states. If it's consistent with our own state goals, then we own it.
Okay, well, I'd like to introduce the email into the record from December 8th, 2017, from Dr. Miller to Michael Myers concerning the glider repeal rulemaking. Are you familiar with this, sir?
Yes, I am.
Who is Mr. Miller or Mr. Myers?
Mr. Myers is the Assistant Attorney General for the state of New York.
Okay. In this email, you write, we've been asked by EDF if NESCOM could submit a comment deadline extension request to EPA. EDF thinks a request from a state organization might be better received at EPA than one from an environmental group. How do you interpret that request?
I'm flattered. Here is a national environmental group that a number of people obviously think have a lot of influence. And on this particular issue, they think we, as a regional state association and our states, might actually have more influence than they do.
Okay. What does EDF stand for?
Environmental Defense Fund.
Okay. Dr. Belzer, I have an email uncovered under the Freedom of Information Act that shows possible collusion between Volvo and the EPA on initiating a glider test, particularly. Have you seen the email before you related to Steve Berry from Volvo Trucks to Bill Charmley and Angela Collin of the EPA?
It's not before me, and I don't believe that I've seen it.
Okay.
Maybe I have, but it's not before me, and I can't tell.
Okay, I was going to ask you some real good questions about that. All right, well, I'm going to have to skip those questions. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to include this article for the record. The article touts Volvo's efforts as good as new, and the process has less impact on the environment in remanufactured engines in Flim, Sweden. And now Dr. Belzer, Volvo Trucks is leading opponent to glider trucks, and they have said in their public comments that gliders are unclean and proclaim that the environmental harm that could result from the repeal of the Phase 2 glider provisions is inexcusable. Can gliders be environmentally friendly in Sweden, but here in the United States, not environmentally friendly?
I would certainly agree that the statements do appear to be contradictory. I think the right way to go about this is simply to recognize that if gliders are no longer available, there will be alternatives, and the alternatives are new trucks, used trucks, and retaining existing trucks in service a longer time. The latter two are probably going to have higher emissions than gliders, and so we don't know the net change in emissions from banning gliders, and unfortunately the EPA approach to assume away those other ways of complying is a problem. Now, EPA had the authority to regulate all rebuilt engines instead of regulating gliders, but it chose not to do that.
Okay. Thank you, sir. I see my time is up. I yield back.
Mr. President. Mr. McNerney?
Well, I thank the chairman, and again, I thank the panelists for testifying this morning. Some glider proponents have claimed that the Volvo Truck Group colluded with EPA's Michigan lab to initiate a study on glider emissions. They also claim that the EPA lab officials never notified the EPA's headquarters staff about these tests. These claims are demonstrably false, and I will show. In fact, the EPA initiated a glider emissions study as a response to a House Appropriations Committee report. And in July 2017, staff at EPA's lab informed EPA's leadership in Washington that they would begin scoping a glider test program. I'd like to enter these emails into the record, the first of which began on July 27, 1917, before the email that was submitted by Mr. Posey, showing that the House Appropriations Committee report urging the EPA to conduct the study.
Without objection.
Thank you. I also like to submit for the record an article showing that the California's Air Resources Board condemned the EPA's move to allow high-polluting older trucks on the road. In fact, this report shows that one old, dirty engine with a glider test kit is equal in emissions to 450 new trucks. I'd like to submit this for the record.
Without objection.
Dr. Miller, you've read the EPA's report on glider emissions. Can you please tell us whether you saw any red flags in reading that report, and why do you think this report is important and valuable?
Yes, I've read the report, and I also, prior to this hearing, checked with my own states and other states outside my region on their own practices, and everything in that report is consistent with state testing practices that our own membership does and elsewhere. The use of accredited facilities, the use of standard test cycles. The protocols exist. We don't need to reinvent them. The certification protocols exist. They were followed. They were clearly presented in the report. All the data collected were clearly presented in the report. They actually did fix that malfunction indicator light before they tested. They indicated that they did that. They showed the data, both with the light on testing and without the light. It was all transparent. The analysis is transparent. It's all numerical. It was done under test cycles that reflect actual real-world driving conditions, including load pooling. This is all standard stuff. There's nothing in there that I could see that just smacks of jury-rigging the results.
Do you believe that the CARB's claim that one dirty truck with the kit is equal to 450 clean trucks in emissions?
I will hedge on that in the sense that it's one truck. I do agree that based on their measurement, that one truck had the emissions of 450 new trucks. Depending on other trucks, it'll be all over the place. I do think, based on the testing, that in general one can say it's about an order of magnitude higher. In that case, it's 2 orders of magnitude higher. I don't know if that's an outlier, but I'm pretty confident it's at least an order of magnitude across the board.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McNerney. Dr. Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'll start with Mr. Long and say I'm grateful. We have, I guess, 1,300 drivers in my district. Kansas, maybe the second, third most number of highway miles in the country. I represent the largest ag producing district in the country. The one thing that my ag producers can do for sure is get our commodities to market cheaper than any competitors out there, and your industry is a big part of that. So I'm grateful for the business that they do. My first job was loading cattle trucks. I was 15 years of age working at a sale barn and worked with a lot of your members as well. In that industry right now, what are the biggest challenges that they're facing, these small owners, the small companies? Mr. Long, yeah.
I would say one of the biggest challenges is indeed over-regulation, and a lot of it is caused by larger entities kind of forcing their will through the government, whether it be regulatory or legislative, to require more mandates, more safety devices that aren't actually improving safety. There's a laundry list of issues that we're currently fighting to prevent that would simply increase costs for our members and burdens for our members rather than promote highway safety, improve their economics, or improve their efficiency. So this is just another example, we think, of smaller businesses getting lost in the discussion and just allowing a government entity and a large corporation to kind of dictate the discussion and ultimately the outcome when our members are going to bear the largest burden, whether it be cost or potentially even running them out of business.
Maybe you talk about electronic logging devices a second, how they're impacting you, especially the live animal hauling industry.
Sure. Only a fraction of our members are involved in the livestock industry, and we appreciate the relief that they've been getting from Congress, or that they will soon be getting from Congress. The ELD issue has been another example of large corporate motor carriers convincing, unfortunately, you and your colleagues, maybe not all of you here at the table today, because it did happen back in 2012, that ELDs were a safety device, and our members contend that they certainly are not. They just track their hours. They don't promote safety at all. So that's an example of a $2 billion mandate that has been kind of forced upon our industry by larger corporate motor carriers in an effort to diminish our efficiency and increase our costs.
Okay, thank you. I'll go to Dr. Belzer. Dr. Belzer, I'm a physician, and as I try to review EPA research, I really have a hard time following it. And I would say that if we practice medical research the way the EPA does, we wouldn't be making some of the great advances that I'm seeing. When they did their analysis, an average trucker 100,000 miles a year, about 6 miles to the gallon, and from what I understand, these gliders have about a 25% better gas mileage. Is that accurate? And that's about 4,200 gallons a year of savings of fuel, less fuel being burned, which certainly would mean less pollution. Did they take that into account in their calculations? I couldn't follow that.
Well, I certainly couldn't either, because I don't think the analysis is actually there. The regulatory impact analysis does not have that inside it. It has 2 or 3 paragraphs describing these glider provisions, but does not have any analysis. There is the paragraph in the preamble to the final rule that contains the sum total of what EPA has disclosed with regard to its analysis. So that's I'm afraid that's all we have to go on. Everything else, to me, is just hearsay.
Also wanted to mention we had a new EPA pathway for sorghum oil to be turned into biodiesel. Would that have any impact on an EPA analysis of this situation if it was coming from sorghum oil rather than the traditional fuels?
Yeah, I have no information or expertise on that, and I keep out of things in which I don't have expertise. I do recall, though, that the comparison, the apparent comparison for gliders is based on the emission standards as of roughly 2001. There's a very large EPA rule mandating ultra-low sulfur diesel that was promulgated after those engines were made. So I would like to know whether the EPA estimate takes account of the emission reductions from the ultra-low sulfur fuel rule, which had substantial benefits according to EPA when they regulated it. That would be useful to know what the actual emissions are and to compare them with the fuel that is actually in use.
Thank you, Dr. Belzer. I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Archer. Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Continuing on that theme by Congressman Marshall, Dr. Belzer, in your testimony, you just discussed a range of consumer responses to no longer being able to purchase gliders. Can you elaborate a little bit more about those potential consumer responses and how the Phase 2 rule, even if it was hypothetically based on valid scientific studies, which I think there's been substantial doubt raised about that, would be counterproductive to what the regulators hope to achieve in the first place?
Well, a common phenomenon with regulations that make major changes in, let's say, tailpipe emission standards is that they do have effects on the market. And so there will often be what's called a pre-buy. The regulations will go into effect in a few years, and during that period of time, those who would be interested in purchasing trucks later will purchase them sooner in order to get in under the wire and do that. So that we can predict that. I believe in EPA's Phase 1 greenhouse gas rule, they took that into account. For some reason, they didn't do that this time. But that is a known phenomenon. I've seen articles in the press suggesting that there are long waits now for vehicles, for heavy-duty trucks. Some of that is driven by the economy, but part of it is a predictable response to the high cost of the Phase 2 standards. You should expect a lot of truck sales to occur prior to that in order to beat that. That happens normally. It happens in trucks. It happens in automobiles as well. It's a normal phenomenon, and that's why the Clean Air Act has a provision in it in order to requires that the effective date for new standards to be delayed a few years so that manufacturers can catch up and be prepared to accommodate that.
What I find interesting about a lot of this and listening to the questions from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, bringing up these various problems from emissions is that since 1980, our economy's expanded by probably close to 500%. Vehicle miles have gone up 98%, population's up over 30%, the energy consumption's up over 30%. Emissions are down by over 50%. And a lot of the discussion here is around like asthma rates. Asthma rates are at record levels, even though the air quality is substantially improved. So I think that, the typical scare tactics from the left on these things that completely misses the real problem. A lot of it has to do with living conditions, household conditions. But I know that doesn't matter to a lot of people. The facts don't. So let me go on and ask Mr. Long a question. In my district, I have over 360 owner-operators. Can you, you made a statement that I'd like for you to elaborate on. You said there's not a shortage of drivers. That's not been our experience.
Sure. If you look at the driver turnover rate among large motor carriers, it's above 90% a year. So essentially, they're almost having 2 drivers per position in the course of a year. We think that's the actual problem, that they're turning through drivers at an exceptional rate. We think steps can be taken by Congress to ensure that our career is one that is appealing and one that is sustainable, rather than one where a young driver enters with no hope of making an actual career out of it because he doesn't make the money, he works in difficult conditions, and no one's really working to address either of those. So we think that rate could certainly come down among smaller fleets. The turnover rate is typically much lower. Drivers get paid better. They have more uniform schedules. They're home with their families more. And those are all steps that can be taken on a national level to certainly address the turnover problem.
The turnover problem, though, how does that impact the individual driver in terms of the more cost that gets added by regulations, and particularly if this, how it impacts with the glider rule?
Sure. Well, this is an example of an area where our members are being priced out of the industry. And let's keep in mind that our members, owner-operators, are the safest on the road by far.
Well, can you put that in context to the bottom line, their take-home pay versus expense?
Yeah, a lot of what we've been talking about in purchasing new trucks is, our members can save 25% on glider kits. That's not necessarily the discussion, simply because they can't afford the new trucks. They're not really saving anything if they can't afford it in the first place. So for them, a glider is an affordable option that also improves their MPGs. It improves their reliability. So as far as bottom lines are concerned, our members run on the slimmest of margins. So expecting them to be capable of purchasing a new truck, it's just not realistic.
Mr. Chairman, time has expired. I will make a comment to you, though. You and I have talked about this issue of air quality and asthma, and,
Yes.
and even CDC and others have indicated that this link that is occasionally they try to make, for instance, in a hearing like this, is missing the mark, and I appreciate your indulgence. I yield back.
Ms. Winardi, you have another?
Excuse me, could I clarify, I'm sorry, that comment on asthma?
Yes, sir.
This is a common misperception I hear quite a bit. Nothing in these comments or my comments or in the what I say in the basis of the EPA rules are based on air pollution causing asthma as a disease. Whatever causes asthma, I don't know. I'm not the expert. But the problem with the air pollution And it is correct, as you're saying, the increasing in asthma rates. The problem with air pollution is that it exacerbates asthma attacks in people who already have asthma for whatever reason.
I appreciate the gentleman making that clarification. I wasn't directing the comment to you. It was a comment made by one of my colleagues. But the fact of the matter is that the problem with asthma has increased substantially, even though air quality has improved remarkably. And you're right. We don't know the cause of asthma. That's one of the conclusions that came out of a CDC report. But I thank the gentleman for his clarification.
Mr. McNerney.
Well, I appreciate the chairman for allowing me another round of questions. It's quite remarkable that the majority is questioning the, quote, scientific integrity and validity, unquote, of the EPA's glider emission study that was conducted at a nationally accredited laboratory, while ignoring the study conducted by the Tennessee Tech University that formed the basis for the EPA's proposed repeal of the glider rule. Now let me review a few facts. The Tennessee Tech study was funded by Fitzgerald Glider Kits and conducted in an unaccredited Fitzgerald laboratory. The study concluded that the remanufactured engines perform better or even on par or better than conventional engines, emitting fewer hazardous chemicals. According to the interim dean of Tennessee Tech's College of Engineering, no credentialed engineering faculty members oversaw the testing, verified the data or calculations, or even wrote or reviewed the final report submitted to Fitzgerald. The interim dean also said the conclusions of the testing were sent to Representative Diane Black, including a, quote, far-fetched, scientifically implausible claim that manufactured truck engines met or exceeded the performance of modern pollution-controlled engines with regard to emissions. The principal investigator of the study removes his name from the study, returned his portion of the Fitzgerald funding, and filed a scientific misconduct claimant with the university. Aside from the flawed testing protocols and unsupported conclusions, he was disappointed that the study had been used for political purposes and wrote, quote, the misuse of results to support political opinions is dangerous, as a dangerous precedent that should worry all university employees. No final report has been issued, and the data from the study has not been publicly released. The general counsel at Fitzgerald Glider Kits has argued that the data and the study are protected from disclosure by the university. Finally, the president of the Tennessee Tech wrote to the EPA, to Representative Black and Fitzgerald, telling them all that they should not reference the study in any way until the university's scientific misconduct investigation is complete. I would like to submit documents supporting what I've just said to the majority for the record. Dr. Miller, I'm not a scientist, or I am a scientist. I forget sometimes. That's the scientific method. But would you trust the conclusions of a study like that?
Let's just say if I was putting myself in the shoes of the state in an enforcement case and I had to go to a court with that kind of study as proof, I'd be looking for a way to get out. I kind of call it like the alien experiment. They took a probe, they stuck it in a smokestack, and they looked at it, and they said, gosh, you know, it's just as clean as a modern engine. That just doesn't pass muster.
Well, Dr. Miller, do you have any response to the fact that this study has been pivotal to the efforts by Fitzgerald Glider Kits, the glider industry, and the Trump administration's EPA in trying to justify their rationale for repealing the glider provisions that limit productions of glider vehicles?
Well, you know, it certainly made it into EPA's proposal. They cited it when proposing to reinstate the glider kit loophole. And it certainly made the press. So, yes, it got attention. We're talking about it today.
We are. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Babbitt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Appreciate all you witnesses. I do have several questions here. I'd like to start with Mr. Long. In your experience with the trucking industry, how do you think gliders promote recycling and the smart use of fossil fuels?
Sure, thanks. Let me say thank you for your interest in small business trucking issues. It's really greatly
Sir,
appreciated.
proud to do it.
Yeah, we've seen rates that gliders can recycle millions of pounds of steel each year. Our members who use them report that they've saved a mile per gallon, as much as a mile per gallon on fuel efficiency, which over the course of a year can translate to 3,000 gallons of diesel fuel. These are all issues that I think have gotten a little bit lost in the conversation about the overall public health impacts. But another one that I want to touch on is something that no one's really addressed at all, and that's that taking owner-operators off the road, pricing them out of the industry, is taking the most experienced and safe drivers off the road. They're going to be replaced with young, inexperienced drivers who are certainly not going to be operating as safely, and you will probably see crash rates go up. So I think that's another public health consideration people need to take into account when talking about this. It's a much bigger picture than simply an EPA study and a Tennessee Tech study.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And then one more. Your story about Lauren Hunt really resonated with me. It's a great example of innovation and the American dream. And I wanted to ask you, is Lauren's experience unique, or do others in the trucking business experience similar challenges that he did?
Lauren's story came to us a while ago. Since we started telling our members that we would be participating in this event, and since we've been getting more engaged in the glider kit issue in general, we've been getting more and more stories like his. Yeah. We've had members just this week send us their cost estimates for refurbishing or repairing new trucks with the new technology, and how much they let us know that it costs tens of thousands of dollars, but they're also unable to make any money off that truck because it's been in the garage so long. So we've been getting a slow stream of stories about this, and I anticipate because of today we'll probably be getting even more.
Okay, all right, thank you very
Sure,
much,
thank
Mr.
you.
Long, appreciate it. Now, following that up about recycling, Dr. Belzer, what type of data or information was excluded in the EPA's Phase 2 regulatory impact analysis that should have been considered to ensure its reliability when used to influence policy and regulations?
In this context, EPA has guidance on the conduct of regulatory impact analyses, just like as OMB does. EPA's guidance directs the components of the agency to conduct a proper analysis of the incremental costs and benefits of every kind of material provision of a rule. That's been in EPA's own guidance for a decade or two. They didn't follow that in this case. So what you have in the 1,100-page analysis, you just don't have anything there. So I can't tell you why that's true. It's a provision that's a significant one. If it were not a significant one, we wouldn't be talking about it. But it wasn't subjected to analysis that we would normally expect. If I had been working in the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in 2016, I would have advised the administrator to return the rule because the analysis is significantly incomplete. They know how to do it correctly. There's no mystery about that. These are not complicated analytic questions.
Okay, and then lastly, in your straw man RIA, you state that as a result of the Phase 2 final rule, the glider industry will be destroyed and employment losses are highly plausible. Can you give us an idea of how many American jobs will be lost as a result of this rule?
I think it's difficult to do, and there are problems with counting job losses in a regulatory impact analysis. That is a complicated matter in economics, and one that the way to go about this is actually to count them, try to estimate them separately, not to count them as benefits and costs or one or the other. It is difficult to do because you don't know to what extent the people working in this in the glider manufacturing business, where they would go. That has to be estimated to see what happens to them. In a full employment economy, they would go elsewhere.
Right.
in a less than full employment economy, we don't know what's going to happen to them. And many of these jobs are located in rural areas where the alternatives may not be as rich as they are, let's say, in New England.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Bagman. Mr. Weber.
Man, I don't know where to start. Don't start? Okay, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. At least I'm not a scientist, I'm just saying. I have a hypothetical scenario which I want each of y'all to answer yes or no to. It's a question that's pretty simple. Let's say a cell phone company wants to test which phone produces data faster, an Apple, iPhone, or a Samsung Galaxy. Samsung reaches out to the phone company and says, we can help you figure out which one's faster. Samsung will supply you with 2 iPhones and 2 Galaxies. We suggest you process this particular data and complete the test within this time frame. The cell phone company, without contacting Apple, okay, conducts the test in accordance with Samsung's suggestions, finding, surprise of all surprises, that the Samsung is 10 times faster. The cell phone company then markets to you, the consumer, that the Samsung Galaxy is hereby declared 10 times faster than the Apple iPhone, according to that study. If you were made aware of the circumstances of that cell phone study, would you trust that cell company's marketing statement that the Samsung was 10 times faster than the iPhone? Is it Tsang?
Yes, Congressman.
Would you trust that study?
I can only speak to the legal requirements related to the rulemaking, unfortunately.
Are you also a scientist?
I am.
I'm just kidding. No. So, Mr. Long?
No.
Dr. Miller?
On your assumption that that's what EPA did, I would say, no, that would be wrong.
All right.
EPA did not do
Do you carry an iPhone or a Samsung?
I've done both. Actually, I do have both.
Okay. Dr. Belzer?
I tend to distrust all marketing, so I would treat this claim the same way I treat all other claims.
You say you can or can't?
I would distrust all of it.
All marketing?
All marketing claims.
Okay.
In the same way that I often have a skeptical regard to preambles of regulations.
So that means your wife tells you what to buy?
No, not on technology.
No, okay, I'm just checking. Well, look, it seems very interesting to me. We've got older engine. By the way, Mr. Long, you'll be interested in this. I owned an air conditioning company for 35 years, sold it a year ago. We've dealt with the EPA on refrigerant requirements and all kinds of stuff, head trucks and the whole 9 yards. Some friends of mine at church got me into the hot shot business. I ran a trucking company for a short time until I ran for the Texas legislature, and then I couldn't keep building it. So I've been down those roads. I've been Tex dotted, US dotted, and everything else. So I have trucking industry experience. Does this set a precedent where no older engines are able to be used for anything, antique cars? Are we afraid of that? What do you think, Mr. Long?
No, because drivers will just continue to use their current engines, or they'll buy used trucks with older engines as well.
Well, sure. Shouldn't we really be reluctant to change what small business owners are allowed to do, of which I was one of, allowed to do without knowing that we for sure have enough reliable information / studies? Shouldn't we really be reluctant to change that?
Absolutely, and I think our members would say that accounts for all trucking policies, not just this one.
Dr. Miller, would you agree that we absolutely need enough concise, concrete evidence before we change this?
I think we have it. And to your earlier question about do you think it affects antique car owners? No, it doesn't. Those are old cars. There's no question about that. We're talking about
But they use old engines.
old cars with old engines.
And these are old engines that go in new trucks.
Right,
And if
but
you read
those are the first certificates of ownership, titles transferred for those gliders. You don't have that with an antique car. It wouldn't be covered.
Well, if you read what the EPA was claiming, and by the way, I was on the Environmental Reg Committee there in Texas before I got demoted to Congress, and Gary Palmer was right. We don't know what causes asthma, but we have reduced our NOx and greenhouse gases a lot. And we have an increase in asthma. So are we maybe too worried without that proof I'm talking about? So what what does it, how many more studies should we go through? Does that include an economic impact study, in your opinion, Dr. Miller? Should we have an economic impact study? I know you all talked about it's hard, or maybe it was Dr. Belzer said it's hard to make that calculation. But before we interrupt that business practice, shouldn't we have a study in that regard as well?
I would assert that we have that information. We have the cost of essentially a post-2010 engine emissions control, and that's from 2000.
Yeah.
We have that cost, which is essentially what presumably one could use as a basis for a cost to the glider kit industry. It's about $670 per engine. People may think that's low, so double it, triple it. Say it's about 2,000. That's fine, because if you're interested in small businesses, if we allow that amount of emissions from glider kits that could be controlled for less than $2,000, in my region, we're already controlling small businesses that start at $2,000 per ton or more.
Where's your region?
It's the Northeast. So we're talking New York, New Jersey, and apparently the rich folks of New England, which I don't know. So
I notice you're not wearing a bow tie, and he is.
I'm actually from Texas.
I got you.
But putting that aside, these are cost savings, I will say, for folks who are using pre-emission control. I don't disagree with that. They're simpler engines. They're dirtier engines. They're simpler engines. They're easier to maintain. But those cost savings aren't absolute. Those are cost shifts. They're cost shifts to public health impacts. You talk about the incidence of asthma going up, but pollution going down. I take that as there are more people with asthma, so it's more important to address the pollution that's affecting those people. So I take that as even more of a reason to move forward. On the small business side, we're already controlling or asking small businesses in our region to control at costs well above what it looks like it would cost to bring glider kits up to modern pollution standards. That's going to have impacts on people's jobs. We have to meet these standards to protect public health.
Well, we're going to disagree about that, Mr. Chairman. I'm well over my time, so thank you very much for your indulgence.
You're welcome. I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimonies and members for their questions. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from members. This hearing is adjourned.